The story usually begins at the end. Flags coming down, crowds filling squares, statues cracking and falling into dust. History teaches that the Soviet Union collapsed because belief vanished or leaders lost control. That version is dramatic, clean, and comforting. It is also incomplete. This story opened somewhere quieter. In offices where calculators hum late into the night. In factories where machines still run, but no longer matter. In grocery stores where shelves thin out without warning. Long before the world saw a collapse, something inside the system was already decaying. Not borders, not armies, money. The Soviet state was built on a promise that it could command reality itself. Prices would be fixed, wages would be guaranteed, the future would be planned. For decades, that promise appeared unbreakable. Then it began to fail. Quietly. Think about that. What happens when a superpower can launch rockets into orbit, but cannot price bread honestly? Power, at its core, depends on coordination. Food must move. Energy must flow. Work must connect to reward. The Soviet system claimed it could replace markets with commands. Instead of prices, there were quotas. Instead of profit, there were targets. Instead of competition, there was obedience. On paper, it looked flawless. Every factory knew what to produce. Every worker knew their role. Every citizen was promised security. But beneath the surface, a fragile bargain existed. The state would decide value, and the population would accept it as truth. As long as shelves stayed stocked and wages still bought food, belief held. Once that link weakened, everything else followed. Control over millions of lives depended on economic signals that no longer worked. The system did not collapse overnight. It began to suffocate, slowly, as reality drifted away from the numbers meant to describe it. Imagine walking through a Soviet city during its final decades of apparent strength. Concrete towers stretch across the skyline. Smoke rises from factories. Trains rumble past with military precision. The streets look orderly. The state looks firm. But listen closely, and you hear something else. The quiet frustration of workers producing goods nobody wants. The soft bargaining that replaces official prices. The unspoken knowledge that some things are always missing. Soap, meat, spare parts. These absences are not accidents. They are signals. In a functioning economy, prices warn of scarcity. In this system, prices are frozen. Scarcity has nowhere to speak. So it leaks out through empty shelves and long lines. Think about that. When truth cannot appear in numbers, it appears in daily life. Slowly, predictably, and without permission. The Soviet Union did not lack resources. It controlled vast land, rich soil, oil, gas, and minerals. It commanded a massive workforce and advanced scientific talent. On paper, it should have thrived. Yet abundance alone does not create prosperity. Incentives matter. Signals matter. Feedback matters. In the Soviet model, success was measured by volume, not usefulness. Factories were rewarded for meeting quotas, not serving needs. Producing 10,000 shoes mattered more than whether those shoes fit anyone. Steel tonnage mattered more than quality. Numbers became the goal. Reality became secondary. Over time, managers learned to game the system. Reports were polished. Failures were hidden. Shortages were explained away. The economy began to drift from the lives it was meant to serve. And the further it drifted, the more force was required to keep it moving. Every system relies on trust, whether it admits it or not. Trust that money represents value. Trust that work leads to reward. Trust that tomorrow will function. In the Soviet system, trust was enforced rather than earned. Citizens were told that stability was guaranteed, that shortages were temporary, that the plan always knew best. For years, that message worked because alternatives were limited. But trust erodes when daily experience contradicts official claims. When people see production reports rising while stores grow emptier, doubt spreads. Quietly, in kitchens, in queues, in whispered conversations. Think about that. A state can control media and borders, but it cannot control live reality forever. Once belief cracks, enforcement must increase. And enforcement has costs, both economic and human. Money, in any society, is a language. It tells producers what to make. It tells consumers what they can afford. It tells planners where resources are scarce. In the Soviet Union, that language was silenced. Prices were political decisions, not reflections of supply and demand. Wages were guaranteed regardless of output. Losses were absorbed by the state without consequence. At first, this seemed humane. No unemployment, no price shocks, no visible instability. But over time, the cost grew invisible. Without honest prices, there was no way to measure success or failure. Waste accumulated quietly. Inefficiency became normal. The economy kept moving, but direction was lost. Imagine flying aircraft with the instruments painted over. As long as conditions remain calm, flight continues. When turbulence hits, disaster follows. The official story insisted that the system was strong. Growth targets were announced. Production figures were celebrated. Speeches declared progress inevitable. Yet these numbers existed in a closed loop. They were generated to satisfy the plan, not to reflect reality. Each layer of reporting pushed bad news upward, softer and smaller than before. No one wanted to be the bearer of failure. The result was a system increasingly blind to itself. The state believed its own paperwork, and paperwork said everything was fine. Think about that. When leaders govern through numbers that lie, they lose the ability to correct course. By the time shortages became impossible to hide, the damage was already deep. This rut did not announce itself with crisis. It crept. A missing shipment here, a delayed repair there, workers showing up but doing less, machines running but producing junk. Each problem seemed manageable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. The economy was losing its ability to adapt. It could not respond to change because change was denied. Instead of correcting prices, the state issued directives. Instead of improving incentives, it increased pressure. Instead of admitting limits, it expanded promises. The gap between official claims and lived reality widened. And in that gap, faith drained away. Control remained, but legitimacy weakened. Power still looked absolute, but its foundation was hollowing out. The danger of slow failure is that it feels normal. People adapt to scarcity. They find workarounds. They trade favors. They rely on networks outside the official system. These adaptations keep society functioning, but they also mask decay. The state interpreted survival as success. In reality, survival came despite the system, not because of it. Think about that. When informal solutions replace formal structures, authority is already slipping. The Soviet economy continued to function, but only through quiet improvisation that planners neither understood nor controlled. This shadow economy became the real economy, and the official one became theater. By the time the world noticed the cracks, the core mechanisms were already broken. The Soviet Union still looked powerful. Its armies stood ready. Its borders remained intact. Its leaders spoke with confidence. But power without economic truth is temporary. The system had lost its ability to learn, to adjust, to admit error. This was not collapse yet. It was suffocation. Slow, invisible, relentless. The central question was no longer ideological. It was mechanical. How long can society function when money no longer tells the truth? How long can control replace coordination? The answer would come later. But the ending was already written, quietly, in the language of prices that never moved and promises that no longer meant anything. For much of the 20th century, the Soviet Union looked indestructible. Its cities spread outward in long lines of concrete and steel, symbols of permanence rising from fields and forests. Factories thundered day and night, their machines echoing with purpose. Smokestacks marked progress. Trains crossed vast distances with military precision. From the outside, this was the image of unstoppable momentum. The state owned the land, the factories, the resources, and the labor. Nothing appeared beyond its reach. Central planning promised order where chaos once ruled. No unemployment, no sudden price spikes, no visible instability. Stability itself became proof of strength. Think about that. In a world shaped by crises, a system that never visibly shakes looks invincible. The promise was simple and powerful. The state would plan production, allocate resources, and guarantee basic needs. In return, citizens would work, comply, and trust. For decades, this bargain seemed to hold. Wages arrived on time. Housing was assigned. Food, though limited, was predictable. Prices barely moved year to year, creating a sense of certainty unknown in many market economies. To outsiders, this looked humane. To supporters, it looked superior. Why worry about profit when survival is guaranteed? Why allow markets when the state can decide rationally? The Soviet model presented itself as a machine built to eliminate waste and inequality. And on paper, it did exactly that. From the inside, the illusion was carefully maintained. Ministries glowed late into the night, walls covered in charts, quotas, and progress reports. Each sector had targets. Each factory had numbers to hit. Each manager knew what success looked like, at least officially. Reports moved upward through layers of approval, each one smoothing rough edges. Shortfalls became delays. Delays became temporary issues. Temporary issues became successes waiting to happen. The language of planning was optimistic by design. Failure was framed as sabotage or miscommunication, never as systemic weakness. Questioning the plan meant questioning the state itself, and that carried consequences. Silence became safer than honesty. The scale of the system reinforced belief. The Soviet Union was vast, stretching across climates and time zones. It produced oil, coal, steel, grain, and weapons in enormous quantities. It sent satellites into space and men into orbit. These achievements mattered. They signaled competence. They suggested that central control worked. If the state could master physics and engineering, surely it could manage economics. Think about that assumption. Technical success became proof of economic wisdom. Few stopped to ask whether building rockets and feeding populations required the same mechanisms. The visible triumphs overshadowed quieter failures that touched daily life. Growth figures reinforced confidence. Official statistics showed steady expansion. Output rose year after year. Entire cities were built around single industries. Employment was universal, at least in name. The idea of economic insecurity seemed foreign. In contrast to the volatility of capitalist economies, the Soviet system appeared calm and predictable. That calm was its greatest advertisement. But it came at a price. Growth was measured by quantity, not usefulness. More tons, more units, more output. Value was assumed, not measured. When everything counts as success, nothing is truly evaluated. Inside factories, this logic shaped behavior. Managers focused on hitting quotas by any means necessary. If a target required 10,000 units, 10,000 units were produced, regardless of quality. Broken items counted. Unusable goods counted. Producing something mattered more than producing something useful. Workers learned quickly that effort and outcome were disconnected. Showing up mattered more than performing well. Innovation became risky. Meeting the plan was safe. Over time, this drained motivation. Why improve a process when failure carried punishment and success carried little reward? The system discouraged excellence while rewarding compliance. And compliance kept the illusion alive. Resources were allocated through political channels rather than economic need. Regions competed for favors, not efficiency. Factories stockpiled materials they might need later, fearing shortages. This hoarding worsened scarcity elsewhere. Transportation bottlenecks multiplied. Warehouses filled with goods nobody wanted, while stores lacked essentials people needed. Yet on paper, everything balanced. Targets were met. Plans were fulfilled. The economy appeared strong. Think about that contradiction. A system can meet every goal it sets and still fail its population. The illusion of strength depends on the goals chosen. The absence of visible unemployment reinforced belief. Everyone had a job. But employment without productivity is not strength. It is cost disguised as stability. Many jobs existed to absorb labor rather than create value. Entire layers of administration managed reporting rather than production. The state paid wages regardless of output, absorbing inefficiency as a political expense. For years, this was manageable because resources were abundant and external pressures limited. The system could afford to carry dead weight, but dead weight accumulates. And when conditions change, it becomes a burden. The global environment also helps sustain the illusion. During periods of high energy prices, exports brought in foreign currency. This masked internal inefficiency. Imports filled gaps domestic production could not. Technology was acquired from abroad when needed. These inflows delayed reckoning. The system appeared flexible, even adaptive, but adaptation came from outside, not from internal correction. The core mechanisms remained rigid. Prices stayed fixed. Incentives stayed broken. The economy moved forward, but only because momentum carried it. Citizens adapted as well. They learned how to navigate shortages. They built informal networks to exchange goods and favors. This quiet ingenuity kept daily life functioning. It also hid failure. When people solved problems privately, the system seized no crisis. The state interpreted resilience as validation. In reality, resilience existed despite the system. Think about that. Survival strategies can conceal decay. The stronger the people adapt, the weaker the feedback becomes. From afar, rivals misread the situation. The Soviet Union appeared disciplined and unified. Its ability to mobilize resources for large projects impressed observers. Few saw the inefficiency beneath the surface. Fewer still understood the cost of suppressing economic signals. The illusion of strength shaped global perceptions and domestic confidence alike. Leaders believed their own narrative. Why doubt a system that had endured wars, rebuilt cities, and challenged global powers? Why suspect fragility when the structure looks so solid? Yet strength built on denial is fragile by definition. The Soviet economy relied on continuous obedience to plans that grew less connected to reality each year. The longer this continued, the harder correction became. Admitting error meant admitting that decades of certainty were wrong. That risk was political, not just economic. So denial persisted. Targets were adjusted. Language softened. Promises expanded. The illusion demanded maintenance, and maintenance demanded silence. The result was a system that looked unstoppable precisely because it could not admit weakness. Its size and stability hid internal decay. Its achievements masked inefficiency. Its certainty replaced curiosity. Think about that. The most dangerous systems are not those that fail loudly, but those that fail quietly while insisting on their own perfection. By the time cracks became visible, the cost of repair had multiplied. This was the world as Chapter 2 closes. A superpower at apparent peak strength. Cities built. Armies ready. Plans fulfilled. Confidence unshaken. Yet beneath the concrete and steel, the foundations were drifting away from economic truth. The system was not poor. It was mispriced. It was not chaotic. It was blind. And blindness, more than any enemy, would shape what came next. The real damage did not announce itself with panic or protest. It unfolded quietly, in the ordinary rhythm of daily life. Prices stopped meaning what they claimed to mean. Money lost its voice. In a functioning economy, price is a signal. It tells producers what is scarce. It tells consumers what must be rationed. In the Soviet system, that signal was silenced by design. Prices were fixed by decree, held steady year after year, as if reality itself could be frozen. On paper, this created stability. In practice, it created blindness. When everything is cheap on paper, nothing is truly available. Scarcity does not disappear. It simply finds another way to express itself. That expression took the form of absence. Shelves stood half empty. Lines stretched around corners. People waited not knowing what would arrive, only that something might. This was not because goods did not exist. Warehouses were often full. Factories continued to produce. The problem was movement and matching. Without prices to guide allocation, goods went to the wrong places, at the wrong times, in the wrong quantities. Transportation systems strained under mismatched priorities. A factory might lack one small component and halt entirely, while another stockpiled materials it did not need. Think about that. An economy can produce plenty and still fail to deliver. Inside factories, the consequences deepened. Since output targets mattered more than usefulness, quality deteriorated. Workers had little reason to care. A defective item counted the same as a good one. Meeting the quota mattered. Improving the product did not. Over time, pride in work faded. Effort became symbolic. Presence replaced performance. Machines ran, but they ran poorly. Repairs were delayed. Spare parts were scarce. Entire production lines existed to satisfy plans, not people. The economy kept producing noise and motion, but less and less value. To compensate, managers hoarded. If a factory received materials, it held on to them, fearing future shortages. This behavior was rational at the individual level and disastrous at the system level. Hoarding amplified scarcity elsewhere. Supply chains fractured. No one trusted deliveries to arrive on time, so everyone grabbed what they could. This created artificial shortages on top of real inefficiencies. Central planners responded with more directives, more rules, more pressure. None of it addressed the root cause. Without price signals, planners were guessing. And guessing at scale magnifies error. As shortages spread, the state faced a choice. Admit the problem or hide it. It chose concealment. Reports were adjusted. Delays were blamed on weather, transport, or sabotage. Targets were redefined. Language softened. A shortfall became a temporary imbalance. A failure became a transition period. Think about that. When truth is politically dangerous, it is redesigned. The system learned to lie to itself slowly and convincingly. Each layer of bureaucracy filtered reality until leaders saw only what they expected to see. The breakdown of cause and effect was the most dangerous shift. In a healthy system, bad decisions produce visible consequences, which force correction. In the Soviet economy, consequences were absorbed by the state. Losses were covered. Inefficiency was tolerated. There was no clear feedback loop. A factory could waste resources for years without penalty. A ministry could misallocate supplies without accountability. The bill existed, but it was hidden. And hidden costs accumulate. They do not vanish. They wait. External conditions eventually expose what internal denial had concealed. When global energy prices weakened, foreign currency inflows shrank. Exports that once covered inefficiency no longer sufficed. Imports became harder to afford. Technology gaps widened. The system relied increasingly on aging machinery and outdated methods. Productivity lagged further. Think about that moment. The tide goes out and weaknesses appear. What looked like strength under favorable conditions revealed fragility under pressure. Foreign currency had been a quiet stabilizer. It allowed the state to buy what it could not produce efficiently. When that option narrowed, choices became painful. Cut imports, reduce promises, or borrow credibility. The state chose delay. It borrowed time by stretching commitments, by deferring maintenance, by leaning on faith. But credibility, once borrowed, must be repaid. And repayment requires change. Change was politically risky. So delay continued. Attempts at reform arrived late and uneven. Controls were loosened in some areas while incentives remained broken in others. Prices were partially freed without reliable supply. Enterprises were given autonomy without accountability. The result was confusion. Shortages worsened. Inflation pressures appeared without mechanisms to manage them. Trust eroded faster. People saw movement, but not improvement. Think about that. Reform that exposes truth without fixing structure accelerates collapse. It removes the mask before healing the wound. At the heart of the crisis was a simple failure. Money no longer connected effort to reward. Workers saw no reason to work harder. Managers saw no benefit in innovation. Consumers saw no relationship between income and availability. The social contract frayed. The promise that the state could provide stability rang hollow. Once belief fades, enforcement must rise. Surveillance increased. Controls tightened. Yet force cannot manufacture value. It can only redistribute what remains. And what remained was shrinking. The informal economy expanded further. People relied on personal networks, favors, and barter. Official channels became symbolic. Real life happened elsewhere. This shadow system kept society functioning, but it drained authority. The state no longer mediated daily survival. People did. Think about that shift. When survival bypasses institutions, institutions lose power. The economy was still active, but the state was no longer its center. Inside leadership circles, confusion grew. Plans no longer worked as expected. Directives produced unintended consequences. Data conflicted. Trust in reports weakened. Yet admitting the scale of failure threatened legitimacy. The system was trapped. Continue denying reality and drift toward collapse, or confront reality and risk immediate instability. The choice was postponed again and again. Time was treated as an ally. It was not. The turning point was not a single event. It was a realization spreading quietly. The system could command output, but it could not create value. It could order production, but it could not align incentives. It could enforce compliance, but it could not restore trust. Once that truth settled in, momentum shifted. People stopped believing promises. Workers disengaged further. Managers protected themselves. The state spoke, but fewer listened. The unraveling accelerated because trust, once broken, does not degrade slowly. It collapses. Savings lost meaning. Wages felt symbolic. Effort became optional. The economy did not stop. It hollowed out. Think about that. Collapse is not always explosive. Sometimes it is erosion, layer by layer, function by function, until what remains cannot support the weight placed upon it. By the time leaders understood the depth of the problem, the mechanisms holding society together were already failing. Price signals were distorted beyond repair. Supply chains were fractured. Belief was gone. The economy had become a stage where everyone acted out roles they no longer believed in. Production continued. Orders were issued, but the connection between action and outcome was severed. This was the moment when failure became irreversible, not because resources vanished, but because coordination did. An economy without trust is a body without nerves. It cannot feel pain, and therefore cannot heal. The Soviet system had lost its ability to sense reality. And without that ability, power drifted away, silently, predictably, toward an ending that now required no enemies. When the collapse finally became visible, it looked sudden. Flags were lowered. Borders shifted. Institutions dissolved almost overnight. To the outside world, it felt like a shock. Inside the system, it was a final stage of a process already complete. The ending had been written years earlier in warehouses full of unusable goods, in ledgers filled with meaningless numbers, and in promises stretched beyond credibility. The economy could no longer support the state that depended on it. Wages arrived, but they no longer bought certainty. Savings existed, but they no longer protected the future. The mechanisms that once coordinated daily life stopped responding. Think about that. A system does not fall when symbols change. It falls when it can no longer function. Supply chains broke first. Cities that relied on centrally planned deliveries found themselves exposed. Factories waited for inputs that never arrived. Transportation networks stalled without clear priorities. Shops opened, but shelves stayed empty. People lined up out of habit more than hope. The guarantee of provision, once the foundation of legitimacy, vanished. What remained was improvisation. Barter replaced currency. Personal networks replaced institutions. Survival moved from the public system into private hands. This shift was not ideological. It was practical. When official channels failed, people build alternatives. And when alternatives work better, authority drains away. Money lost its meaning at the worst possible moment. Inflation surged as controls weakened without replacement. Prices rose faster than wages. Savings evaporated. Years of stored effort disappeared in months. Trust, already thin, collapsed entirely. Imagine watching your lifetime of work dissolve because numbers no longer correspond to reality. That experience reshapes a society. It teaches that promises are fragile and systems can lie. The collapse was not just economic. It was psychological. Faith in coordination itself was damaged. Industries that once symbolized strength fell silent. Machinery rusted. Skilled workers left or disengaged. The state, stripped of revenue and legitimacy, could no longer enforce coherence. Regions drifted. Authority fragmented. What had been held together by command now required consent it no longer possessed. Think about that transition. Control can hold structures together, but only trust keeps them alive. Once trust disappears, power must shrink to match reality. The human cost was severe. Standards of living fell sharply. Uncertainty replaced predictability. Social guarantees vanished without warning. For many, the collapse felt like betrayal rather than defeat. The system had promised stability above all else. When that promise broke, it broke everything built upon it. Yet even in the chaos, one truth became clear. The economy had not been destroyed in a single moment. It had been hollowed out over decades. Collapse was not the cause. It was a result. In the years that followed, rebuilding required confronting realities long denied. Prices had to reflect scarcity. Incentives had to matter again. Loss had to be acknowledged. This process was painful and uneven. It exposed inequalities and failures previously hidden, but it also restored feedback. Reality, once suppressed, returned loudly. The lesson was harsh but clear. Systems cannot escape economic truth forever. They can only postpone it. This story matters beyond one country or one era. Think about that. Any system that silences prices, hides losses, and prioritizes appearance over function is borrowing time. Stability without truth is temporary. Control without feedback is brittle. When money stops telling the truth, coordination fails. And when coordination fails, power follows it into the dark. The Soviet Union did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it refused to admit weakness. It chose certainty over correction, promises over signals, and control over truth. The result was not sudden collapse, but slow suffocation. A lesson written quietly in empty shelves and meaningless numbers, long before the world noticed the end. If this story helped you see history differently, subscribe for more cinematic explorations of power, money, and collapse. And share this documentary with others who want to understand how systems really fall long before the flags come down.